Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world that was not very cozy. You can pull your blanket up to your chin, maybe sip some tea, and relax. Because while you're safe in bed, we're going to wander through the Middle Ages, a time when people thought disease came from bad smells, witches lurked behind every cowl, and torture was, well, something like a public hobby. The good news is you don't have to live it. You just get to listen, slowly, sleepily, and maybe wonder how anyone got through it without immediately giving up. So let's begin with torture, which is admittedly not the cheeriest bedtime story. But when people imagine the medieval world, torture always comes up first. Dungeons, racks, chains, grim men in hoods who probably hadn't washed in weeks. The truth is, it wasn't quite constant, and most medieval people weren't tortured daily, despite what Hollywood suggests. But it was used often enough, and with such creativity, that it deserves a long, meandering stroll. Let's start gently. Torture in the Middle Ages was less about sadism, though there was plenty of that, and more about control. Kings, popes, and city councils like to keep people in line. And when you live in a world where most folks can't read and gossip spreads faster than bread mold, sometimes a public display of pain seemed like the easiest way to make a point. Subtlety wasn't exactly their strong suit. So instead of a stern warning, you might get tied to a wooden contraption and stretched like dough. The rack is probably the most famous. Picture a heavy wooden frame with rollers at each end, ropes tied to your wrists and ankles. Slowly, with the turn of a crank, your limbs were pulled tighter until joints began to slip apart. It sounds dramatic, and it was. The irony is, people didn't usually die on the rack. It was more about fear. Dislocated shoulders, shredded muscles, sometimes broken bones. But the victim often lived to tell the tale or confess whatever nonsense the authorities wanted. After all, if you're hanging there with your arms yanked out of their sockets, you'll confess to inventing time travel if they ask. Sleepy thought, isn't it? You can imagine whispering, yes, I did it, just to make the squeaking stop. But the rack was only the beginning. Medieval Europe had a buffet of inventive devices. There was a strappado. That one was almost elegant in its cruelty. You'd be tied with your arms behind your back, then hoisted up by a rope until you dangled like a trussed chicken. Sometimes they let you drop suddenly, stopping just before you hit the ground. The result? Your shoulders popped out of joint. Again, rarely fatal, but always agonizing. And in an odd way, practical. Because unlike an execution, they could recycle you for the next day's questioning. Efficiency was a medieval virtue, after all. Of course, efficiency didn't stop them from being theatrical. Take the infamous Iron Maiden. You've probably seen it in cartoons and Halloween decorations. A tall iron cabinet, shaped vaguely like a person, lined inside with spikes. Close the door, and the victim would be stabbed from all angles. Gruesome, terrifying, and probably not real. Most historians agree that the Iron Maiden was a later invention, a bit of Renaissance showmanship cooked up to make the dark Middle Ages look even darker. So the next time someone tells you about poor souls locked inside one, you can smile sleepily and think, well, at least that part was exaggerated. Comforting in its way. Now, let's drift sideways into the more peculiar tortures, the ones that make you blink and wonder if people were just bored. There was the pear of anguish, a little metal device shaped like, yes, a pear. It could be inserted into the mouth, or more awkwardly, the other end of the body. A screw at the top widened the petals of the pear. Slowly, painfully, the evidence for its widespread use is sketchy, but it certainly appeared in manuals and collections of torture devices. Whether it was ever applied regularly or simply dreamed up by an imaginative smith, it still says a lot about where medieval minds wandered, somewhere between ingenious and deranged. Then there's the chair of torture. Imagine a plain wooden chair, except covered in spikes. Seat back, armrest, even the footrest, all spikes. Sit someone down, strap them in, and leave them to contemplate their life choices. Not much to say beyond that. It's not the kind of chair you want in your dining room. It was sometimes heated from beneath, which really completed the spa day experience. Speaking of heat, fire was a frequent companion in medieval punishments. Branding was common. A hot iron press against the skin left a permanent reminder of your crime. Thieves might have an F seared into their face. Others got marks on their hands. There's something particularly medieval about solving problems with permanent facial graffiti. Simple, effective, and impossible to forget. Naturally, people found ways to cover the marks. A beard here, a scarf there. But the brand was meant to follow you forever, like a medieval one-star review. Let's drift for a moment into the context. Torture wasn't always random cruelty. It was tied to the justice system. Courts allowed it under specific rules. In much of Europe, torture could only be applied if there was already strong evidence, but not quite enough for conviction. So you had this bizarre legal balance. If someone was almost certainly guilty, they might be tortured to get the confession that sealed it, which, of course, made the whole process circular. You're guilty because you confessed under torture, and you confessed under torture because they decided you were guilty. Neat little loop, isn't it? Almost elegant in a bureaucratic, sleep-inducing way. And we can't forget the role of the church. The medieval church was complicated, full of contradictions. On one hand, priests preached mercy and compassion. On the other, inquisitors weren't exactly gentle. During the Inquisition, torture was sanctioned to extract confessions of heresy. There were limits. Supposedly, you weren't meant to kill the accused. Just scare them, break them down, get them to say the right words, which they usually did because, shocker, being stretched on a rack has a way of clearing your theological doubts. But before you imagine endless torture chambers under every cathedral, it's worth remembering most medieval punishments were far simpler. Fines, pillories, stocks, the public humiliation route. Being locked in a wooden frame with your head and hands sticking out while the townsfolk threw rotten vegetables at you. A little less fatal, a little more comedic, if you ignore the bruising. Sometimes they tied a sign around your neck explaining your crime. This man cheated at bread weights. The Middle Ages took bread very seriously. Starving peasants don't like being tricked with hollow loaves. And then there were executions, which, yes, technically not torture, but they often overlapped. Hanging was common. So was beheading, if you were noble enough to deserve a cleaner death. Burning at the stake for heresy. Drowning in sacks for less glamorous crimes. The line between torture and execution blurred, because people liked a good show. It wasn't just about killing you. It was about making sure everyone in the square learned a lesson. The medieval public didn't exactly have Netflix, so a hanging was the next best entertainment. Some punishments even leaned toward the ridiculous. Trial by ordeal, for example. You might be told to plunge your hand into boiling water. If your skin healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, guilty. Simple. Or you could be tossed into a pond. Sink? Innocent. Float? Guilty. Which is convenient, since most people naturally float at least a little, meaning you'd better start practicing your sinking face. It was justice by physics, which doesn't exactly hold up under scrutiny. But at the time, they believed God would intervene, tipping the scales. Of course, God often seemed to have a suspiciously consistent alignment with local politics. As you drift with me through this medieval nightmare spa, notice how often torture was about symbolism. A burned tongue for liars, a cut hand for thieves. The punishment matched the crime. It was almost poetic in a very heavy-handed, blood-spattered way. Did it work? Hard to say. People kept lying. They kept stealing. Human behavior doesn't change much, whether you're in a digital age or a feudal one. But at least it gave communities the sense that justice was being done, or at least being loudly performed. And now, as your eyes maybe get heavier, let's wander gently toward the royal side of all this. Because torture wasn't just for peasants. Nobles found themselves in hot water, too. Kings used it against rivals. Queens threatened it. Councils wielded it against uppity lords. Power doesn't discriminate when it feels threatened. And besides, what's the point of ruling if you can't occasionally toss a cousin into a dungeon? After all, family squabbles take on a whole new dimension when you own the keys to the torture chamber. But perhaps we'll let that thought hang for a moment, like someone dangling from a strappado rope. We'll drift deeper into the bizarre world of royal punishments in the next stretch. For now, just imagine yourself safe, wrapped up, glad that your worst bedtime torture is an extra pillow that won't stay cool. So we think, if you lived back then, would you have confessed on the rack, or try to hold out? Tell me in the comments before you drift off. So, let's drift back into our medieval haze, where royalty reigned, nobles squabbled, and torture remained a very stylish accessory to power. Because while the average villager might get tossed into the pillory for cheating on bread weights, nobles had their own special arrangements. And kings, naturally, had every reason to use pain as a tool. Not for fun, or at least not publicly, but for politics. And if you're already imagining the pettiness of royal households today, just multiply that by 10, add the faint smell of unwashed velvet, and you'll be close. The interesting thing is, royals and nobles weren't supposed to be tortured in quite the same way as common folk. They were above that sort of thing, honor and bloodlines and all. But you know how rules go. The higher the rank, the more exceptions tend to appear. A rebellious cousin might technically deserve a clean execution, one swift blow from an axe. But if a king really wanted to make a point, suddenly there was a dungeon involved. Because what's the use of power if you can't make your relatives regret being related? One of the favorite royal methods wasn't the rack or strappado, but something far simpler: starvation. Nobles locked in towers, slowly wasting away, while the world outside carried on. There was something poetic about it. A man in shining armor, once rich and powerful, reduced to gnawing on straw. It sent a message, and no blood had to be spilled on the royal carpet. Clean, quiet, and effective. Not exactly pleasant to think about. But then again, neither is your stomach growling at midnight when the fridge is empty. Imagine that, but stretched over weeks. And sometimes it wasn't starvation but suffocation. A number of monarchs found themselves allegedly smothered, not with devices of iron, but with something as banal as a feather bed. Push it down over the face, hold it there, and the problem vanishes. It's an oddly medieval combination of practicality and absurdity. Kings were toppled not by sword, but by bedding. Next time you fluff your pillow, you might remember some prince didn't get back up from his. But royals weren't always the victims. Often, they were the ones signing the orders. King Edward I of England, for example, was particularly creative when it came to punishing rebels. His treatment of William Wallace, yes, that Wallace, was infamous. Hung, drawn, and quartered. That charming method involved hanging until nearly dead, cutting open the abdomen, pulling out the entrails, and then chopping the body into 4 neat pieces. And if you're wondering whether Edward thought this was excessive, well, no. He thought it was just about right. Because rebellion wasn't just a crime, it was an insult to his crown. And medieval kings were nothing if not sensitive about insults. The French weren't much gentler. Take Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad. He was prone to violent fits, once killing several knights in a frenzy. His court alternated between hiding from him and humoring him. When punishment was required, his nobles favored creative displays, burnings, whippings, and naturally, public humiliations. Because if your king is running around believing he's made of glass, you need to remind everyone else that order still exists. Torture became less about extracting confessions and more about reassuring the population that someone, somewhere, was still in charge. The church also played a role in noble tortures, especially with heretics who had inconveniently high social standing. If a peasant whispered strange ideas, he might be ignored. If a noble started doubting church authority, suddenly there was a tribunal, ropes, and firewood involved. Joan of Arc is the obvious example. Not torture in the conventional rack and chain sense, though interrogated endlessly, but condemned to be burned. A spectacle for the people. A reminder that even a figure of charisma and noble support wasn't safe. In the glow of those flames, everyone understood authority was non-negotiable. But some noble tortures veered into the ridiculous. Let's talk about gilded cages. Not metaphorical ones. Literal gilded cages. In Florence, for instance, defeated enemies were sometimes locked into small, ornate cages and hung up for the city to jeer at. No iron spikes, no racks. Just public humiliation in the most cramped, uncomfortable way possible. Imagine crouching for days in a birdcage while your enemies stroll by, tossing insults. It's torture by posture and pride, less bloody but no less degrading. And then there was music. Yes, music. Some prisoners were forced to listen to musicians endlessly, day and night. Now, before you imagine medieval elevator music, picture instead bagpipes or drums played without pause. It sounds almost comical until you realize that lack of sleep, relentless noise, and the impossibility of escape is its own kind of torment. You don't need iron spikes if you have an enthusiastic bagpiper. In a strange way, the Middle Ages understood psychological torture centuries before it became fashionable in modern intelligence circles. Of course, one must mention the Tower of London. It wasn't just a pretty backdrop for tourist photos. It was one of Europe's most notorious prisons. Nobles and royals who displeased the crown often found themselves there. Some were starved, some quietly executed. Others, like Guy Fawkes later on, were tortured on a rack within its walls. The tower's reputation was carefully cultivated, half prison, half haunted legend, because fear is always more effective when it spreads on its own. But what's perhaps most telling is how torture bled into ceremony. Executions weren't private affairs. They were public theater. Nobles were paraded, speeches made, crowds gathered. Torture wasn't just pain, it was performance. The chopping block, the scaffold, the pyre, they were stages, and the condemned played their role. Sometimes defiant, sometimes broken, but always part of the show. Kings and queens understood this. Pain was a message, and the louder it echoed, the better. Take Henry VIII. He didn't just execute wives. He made a display of them. And Boleyn's beheading wasn't carried out in a dingy cell. It was a carefully orchestrated event, meant to remind everyone who was in charge. No rack, no Iron Maiden, just a single dramatic sword stroke. But in its way, it was still torture. Not for and who didn't feel much after, but for the entire court, forced to watch, to whisper, to remember. Psychological torture on a national scale. Henry knew what he was doing. And then there's the pettiness. Kings loved to humiliate rivals before killing them, parading them through streets in chains, stripping titles, forcing humiliating oaths. One might argue this was worse than the physical pain. After all, medieval nobles care about honor almost as much as breathing. To be mocked, spat upon, treated like a common thief, that could break a man as effectively as any rack. And it entertained the masses, which was always a nice bonus. What's interesting is that despite all this, torture didn't necessarily inspire loyalty. It didn't make subjects love their king more. If anything, it sowed fear and resentment. But medieval rulers rarely cared. They weren't aiming for affection. They wanted obedience. And obedience, they reasoned, could be wrung from bodies as well as from minds. That often backfired didn't seem to bother them, because short-term control was always more appealing than long-term stability. A very human impulse. Really, as you drift deeper into the dark, sleepy corners of this history, notice how ritualized all of it was. Torture wasn't random. It was formal. Legal documents approved it. Ceremonies surrounded it. Clergymen prayed over it. Executioners had official titles and salaries. Pain was bureaucratized. That's perhaps the most chilling detail. When cruelty becomes paperwork, it no longer feels like cruelty to those enacting it. It just feels like doing one's job. And on that thought, let's soften our step and drift into something almost absurdly gentle. Because alongside all this horror, medieval royals still liked pageantry, feasts, and tournaments. They could order someone stretched on a rack in the morning, then preside over a joust in the afternoon. The juxtaposition is jarring, yet typical. Humans have always had a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize. 1 hour, watching a man scream. The next, listening to a lute over roasted pheasant. Strange world, isn't it? But don't worry, you're not in it. You're here in the quiet, with the faint hum of your own modern life around you. Safe, relaxed, and hopefully a little more drowsy. So here's a gentle thought to end on. If you were a medieval noble and the king demanded your loyalty through a mix of torture and ceremony, would you have bent the knee or risked the rack? Drift on that question And tell me in the comments if you're still awake enough to type. So let's drift down from the lofty halls of kings and nobles and settle gently into mud-spattered shoes of ordinary people. Because while royal tortures made headlines, or would have if parchment newsletters were a thing, it was the peasants who lived with punishment most regularly. Small crimes, petty squabbles, drunken brawls. These were the backbone of medieval justice. And while a peasant was unlikely to meet the rack, there were plenty of creative little torments waiting just for them. The first thing to remember is that medieval justice was public, very public. The courtroom, if there was one, was often just a table set up in the town square. A magistrate or local lord would hear complaints, waggle a finger, and then hand out punishments that everyone could watch. It wasn't just about justice. It was about entertainment. No Netflix, no football, no late-night talk shows. Instead, you got a neighbor flogged for stealing chickens. Cheap, interactive, and highly memorable. Stocks and pillories were the classics. You know the look, head and hands, or sometimes feet stuck through wooden boards. Victims would stand, or rather sag, for hours or days while passers-by threw rotten vegetables, mud, or the occasional sharp stone. Children, naturally, found this hilarious. Adults, too. And while it might sound almost slapstick, the reality wasn't quite so fun for the person locked in place, unable to swat away flies, fend off kicks, or hide from jeering neighbors. Imagine having to sneeze with your head clamped in a wooden frame. Miserable, yet oddly mundane. Then there was flogging, stripped to the waist, tied to a post, and lashed with whips or rods. Not necessarily fatal, but scarring in more ways than one. The sound alone was enough to silence a crowd. Whack, whack, justice delivered in 10 neat strokes. Sometimes 20, depending on the crime. And all of this under the watchful eyes of a community that, let's be honest, probably enjoyed the break in routine. After all, you get tired of staring at the same sheep in the same field every day. A whipping livened things up. For more colorful offenses, punishments grew creative. Gossiping women might be fitted with a scold's bridle, a metal cage over the head, with a spike bit pressing down on the tongue, designed not only to silence but to humiliate. Picture your neighbor walking to the marketplace, jangling an iron, drooling, unable to speak, while the crowd points and laughs. Not exactly spa treatment. But again, the goal wasn't just pain. It was spectacle. It was to remind everyone that words, especially women's words, carried consequences. Bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight bread faced equally poetic punishments. They could be dragged through the streets with a bad loaf tied around their neck, or forced to sit in the stocks holding a basket of their fraudulent bread for all to see. Because if there's one thing medieval people took seriously, it was bread. Fail at that, and the community would absolutely come after you. Imagine a town meeting where no one cares about murder, but everyone is furious about missing crust. Water, too, became a favorite tool. Dunking stools were reserved for scolds, cheats, or women accused of witchcraft. Victims were strapped into a chair, swung out over a pond, and dunked under again and again. The crowd cheered. The victims sputtered. Sometimes they drowned. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, the point was clear. Don't cross the community, or you'll end up wetter than you planned. And speaking of witchcraft, trials of superstition were their own form of torture. The infamous swimming test required the accused to be tossed into a river or pond. Float, and you were guilty, clearly buoyed up by the devil. Sink, and you were innocent, though sadly drowned. A lose-lose situation, unless you had very strong lungs and a forgiving jury. It wasn't torture in conventional, spiked iron sense, but in terms of psychological dread, it certainly counted. Superstition spilled into other ordeals. Hot iron was popular. A man might be forced to carry a red-hot bar a certain distance, his hands wrapped in cloth. If his wounds healed quickly, God had spoken. Innocent. If they festered, guilty. As for fairness, well, infection in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly rare. The odds were never in your favor. Yet the community accepted it, because when you live in a world with few answers, you put faith in whatever rituals you have, even if it means scalding someone half to death. Of course, peasants didn't always go quietly. Records survive of angry villagers rescuing friends in the stocks, pelting officials instead of prisoners, or even rioting against judges who they felt were unfair. Justice was not as one-sided as it might appear, and every now and then the punishers became the punished, a reminder that crowds are fickle, and even the harshest laws can break under collective grumbling. But torture wasn't only about crime. It was about order, discipline, even morality. Take adultery. Men and women caught in compromising positions could be paraded naked through town, tied together back to back, sometimes with ropes around their necks. Not painful in the bloody sense, but humiliating. Imagine your worst mistake shouted in the market square, while children throw cabbage leaves at you. People often remembered shame more vividly than pain, and medieval authorities knew this. Then there's the curious punishment of animals. Yes, animals. Pigs, dogs, even insects were put on trial in some communities. A pig that killed a child could be dressed in human clothes and hanged. Locusts that ruined crops might be excommunicated in a church ceremony. These bizarre spectacles blurred the line between justice and theater. Torture, punishment, humiliation. It wasn't always limited to humans. Medieval minds applied it wherever they thought divine order had been disrupted, which, frankly, was often. When actual torture was applied to peasants, racks, thumbscrews, whips, it was usually in service of confession, to squeeze out names of accomplices, or simply to speed up the trial. But for everyday folk, it was less about physical torment and more about public discipline. Torture was too expensive, too elaborate, too official. Humiliation was cheaper, easier, more communal, and arguably more effective, because scars fade. But your neighbor never forgets the day you wore the scold's bridle in front of the bakery. And so, ordinary medieval life carried on, punctuated by these little dramas of pain and shame. Fields plowed, bread baked, children raised, all under the looming knowledge that if you stepped too far out of line, the community had ways to deal with you. Small ways, painful ways, embarrassing ways. Not enough to destroy you, just enough to remind you that you belong to the crowd, not to yourself. Strange thing, isn't it? For us, punishment is supposed to be private, locked behind prison walls. For them, punishment was performance, shared, collective, a village pastime. Everyone knew, everyone watched, everyone remembered. Perhaps that's why it lingers in our imagination. Torture wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a story, and medieval people loved nothing more than a story to tell. So, as you drift with me further into this sleepy haze, let's leave the peasants behind for now. They've suffered enough under our gaze. Next, we'll wander into superstition's darker corners, witch trials, inquisitors, and the oddly bureaucratic ways people justified burning their neighbors. But before we float there, a soft question for you. If you had to choose, would you rather spend a day in the stocks or risk the dunking stool? Share your thoughts in the comments if you're still awake. Let's move quietly into another corner of the medieval imagination, where torture wasn't just about pain, but about presentation. Because if there's one thing medieval authorities loved almost as much as punishing people, it was making sure everyone else saw it happen. Justice wasn't done in the dark. It was put on display, like some grim theater performance, and the audience had little choice about attending. They were simply swept along, standing in the square, clutching whatever passed for breakfast, and trying not to faint at the smell of singed hair. It is worth remembering that medieval punishments were rarely carried out in silence. Picture a bustling town square, a platform raised, and a condemned person brought forth. Around them, vendors tried to sell food, beggars angled for drop coins, and small children were hauled up on his shoulders so they wouldn't miss a thing. The medieval sense of entertainment was both wider and narrower than ours. You had fairs, you had mystery plays, and you had torture and executions. 3 options, all in 1 week. So when someone was led to a device, the crowd did not gasp in horror. They leaned in, hoping for a good show. The authorities made sure they got one. Devices like the breaking wheel, for example, weren't designed to work quickly. They were designed to stretch out the process, to give the crowd time to whisper, to shake their heads, and to feel that vague thrill of superiority that comes from watching someone else's downfall. The condemned would be tied to a large wheel. Imagine the frame of a cart lifted upright, and then their limbs were methodically smashed with an iron bar. The goal wasn't to kill instantly, but to break bones in a rhythm that both demonstrated power and gave the viewers something to talk about over dinner. It sounds grisly, and of course it was, but it also had a strangely performative quality. You can imagine townsfolk later saying, "Did you see the way his arm bent? Like a chicken leg." And then returning home to stew, quite literally, some chicken legs. The cruelty was normalized through repetition, through the routine of public life. By watching others punished, the message was clear: behave, or this will be you. And if it was you, well, at least the town would have something to talk about for a few weeks. Of course, not all torture was done in the open square. Much of it took place in quieter chambers, often beneath castles or in special municipal buildings. These spaces were built for efficiency, not comfort. Stone walls, iron hooks, a scattering of chains. Nothing about them suggested hospitality, unless your idea of hospitality involves being asked to confess while someone sharpens knives nearby. The dungeon was less about display and more about pressure. Here, torture became an art of breaking resistance. Water was poured slowly over faces, joints were pulled apart, and fingernails were pried back. None of this required an audience. The only witnesses were the torturer, the victim, and perhaps a clerk, carefully writing down what was said between screams. And yet, even here, the medieval love of spectacle peeked through. Accounts of these sessions were sometimes read aloud in court or summarized to public, as though the grisly details were too entertaining or too useful as deterrent to remain hidden. He confessed after being shown the instruments, a scribe might note, with just enough vagueness to let the imagination run wild. For the audience, the mystery of what those instruments were was often worse than the reality, because imagination fills in gaps with things far more terrifying than iron pincers. Let's drift for a moment toward the strange overlap between torture and medicine. It might sound odd, but many of the same tools used to heal were also used to harm, depending on the context. Take cauterization, for example. In medicine, it was a way to stop bleeding or close wounds by applying a hot iron. In torture, it was a way to cause prolonged agony while leaving the victim alive for further questioning. The same iron rod, heated in the same fire, could either save a life or ruin one. The difference lay entirely in intent. To a medieval mind, this wasn't hypocrisy. It was simply practicality. Tools were expensive, fires were already burning, and efficiency was a virtue, if not for the victim, then at least for the budget. Naturally, we can't forget the role of religion in shaping these practices. The church did not, officially, approve of bloodshed, but it did allow torture under certain conditions, especially when heresy was suspected. Pain was seen not only as punishment but as purification. The body might be destroyed, but the soul could, theoretically, be saved. This led to a peculiar situation, in which men in robes would sanction the use of the rack, while murmuring about mercy. If that sounds contradictory, that's because it was. But contradictions were the bread and butter of medieval theology. You could simultaneously insist on love and charity, while also suggesting someone be stretched until their shoulders dislocated. It was all part of the same worldview. There is also the fascinating detail that torture often required paperwork. Bureaucracy has never been far from human cruelty. Before someone was tortured, a court had to issue permission. This wasn't usually done lightly, though lightly is relative when the threshold was, we need one more witness to back up the accusation of sorcery. Judges would sign off, clerks would record, and only then could the instruments be applied. In some ways, this was meant to provide safeguards to prevent random cruelty. In practice, it mostly meant that cruelty arrived with a neat ribbon of legitimacy, stamped and sealed. The social function of torture can't be overstated. It wasn't just about extracting confessions or punishing criminals. It was about reinforcing the entire system. People needed to see what happened when order broke down. They needed to know that there were consequences, and those consequences were unpleasant enough to keep everyone in line. You might be tempted to ask whether it worked. The answer is, sometimes. Fear is a powerful motivator, but humans are stubborn. Even the prospect of the rack wasn't enough to stop rebellion entirely. People still stole bread, plotted against lords, and muttered about taxes. But the system survived, in part because the spectacle of torture and execution kept enough people wary to tip the balance. Let's drift to one of the more infamous devices, the Iron Maiden. This supposed coffin lined with spikes is often shown in museums and horror films, but the truth is a bit disappointing. Most evidence suggests it was a later invention, or at least greatly exaggerated. The few examples we have are from the 18th or 19th century, built more as curiosities than as real tools. Medieval torturers preferred simpler methods, things that involved ropes, heat, or pressure. Spikes in a coffin were dramatic, yes, but also impractical. And medieval society, for all its love of drama, had a deeply practical streak. So the Iron Maiden, while a powerful symbol, may be more myth than reality. The real tortures were less theatrical, but far more common. Speaking of practicality, the rack was an all-time favorite. Simple to build, easy to use, and undeniably effective. The victim was tied at both ends and slowly stretched until joints gave way. Confessions often followed, though whether those confessions were true is another matter. Pain has a way of making people say whatever they think will make it stop. Medieval courts knew this, but chose to believe the words anyway. It was more convenient that way. A confession, no matter how dubious, closed the case. And a closed case meant everyone could go home, comforted by the illusion that justice had been done. And here's the irony. Many medieval people believed that truth could be revealed through suffering. The body would betray the lies, they thought, and the soul, under pressure, would finally speak honestly. Modern science suggests otherwise, but medieval thought wasn't particularly concerned with neuroscience. It was concerned with order, salvation, and spectacle. If a confession was dragged out of someone by the rack, then it was accepted as valid. The system was self-reinforcing, and the pain of the accused was just another cog in the machinery. Now, as we sit here in quiet, it's easy to imagine ourselves far removed from those times. But the uncomfortable truth is that torture has always followed power, in one form or another. The devices change, the language changes, but the logic often remains. Fear, control, spectacle. Those three elements bind past and present together more tightly than we'd like to admit. It's not the most relaxing thought, but perhaps that's the point. History doesn't exist to reassure us. It exists to remind us of the odd, often unpleasant choices humans have made. And in the medieval world, torture was one of those choices, woven deeply into the fabric of law, faith, and daily life. Let's pause here. What do you think? If you were living in a medieval town and the wheel was set up in a square, would you have gone to watch? Or would you have stayed home, shutters closed, pretending the world was less brutal than it was? Leave a thought in the comments if you like. Let's wander now into another peculiar corner of medieval justice, where torture was less about iron spikes and more about the creativity of humiliation. Because sometimes you need a rack or a wheel to ruin someone's day. All you needed was a sturdy stool, a few buckets of water, or perhaps just the right sort of hat. The medieval mind, endlessly inventive when it came to cruelty, often preferred methods that left the victim alive, but utterly embarrassed. After all, why end a punishment quickly when you could stretch it out for weeks? Letting gossip do the heavy lifting? Take the pillory, for instance. That wooden frame with holes for the head and hands has become one of the most iconic images of medieval justice. In truth, it was more of a social punishment than a physical one. Although standing in the same position for hours while your neck cramped was hardly pleasant, what made the pillory effective was the crowd. Spectators jeered, threw rotten food, sometimes stones, and occasionally more unpleasant substances that no one bothered to catalog. The unlucky individual stood there helpless, the target of every grudge, every joke, and every child with a half-rotten cabbage. There's a kind of efficiency to it. No elaborate device, no specialist torture required, just a plank of wood and a community willing to participate. And they usually were. The pillory gave people permission to vent all the small frustrations of their lives on someone else. Maybe your neighbor's pig wandered into your garden last week. Maybe you're tired of paying taxes to the bailiff. Whatever your irritation, you could work it out with a well-aimed tomato. The person in the pillory might have been guilty of theft or slander, but for everyone else, they were guilty of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, the pillory also carried a certain risk. Crowds are not known for moderation. What began as playful jeering could quickly become violent, and sometimes the victim emerged more bruised than intended, or didn't emerge at all. Officials were supposed to keep order, but let's be honest, once a mob gets going, a few guards with halberds are unlikely to intervene. If the condemned had made enough enemies, the pillory could become an impromptu death sentence, carried out one rotten turnip at a time. Another favorite was a cucking stool, used primarily for women accused of being scolds, gossips, or general nuisances. The victim was strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, then dunked into a river or pond repeatedly. The logic was simple. A woman who talked too much needed to be silenced with water, and so she was plunged beneath the surface, hauled back up, coughing and sputtering, only to be dropped again. It was less about pain and more about ridicule, although the risk of drowning was never far away. The symbolism was almost too obvious. Water as a purifier, washing away sins, or in this case, washing away a sharp tongue. Communities gathered to watch, laughing as the unfortunate woman struggled and gasped. And when it was over, she returned to her life, marked by shame and the knowledge that everyone in town had seen her humiliated. In some ways, it was more damaging than physical torture, because memory lingers far longer than bruises. One could almost hear the whispers. That's her, the one who was dunked last spring. It's worth pausing to note how much of medieval punishment relied on the crowd. Torture in dungeons was hidden, but public punishments were spectacles, binding communities together through shared cruelty. There's a peculiar solidarity in watching someone else suffer. It reassures the viewers that they are safe, at least for today, and reminds them what happens if they stray too far. The pillory, the stocks, the cucking stool, all of them worked best when everyone joined in. There were less punishments than performances, with the condemned forced into the starring role. And yet, not every punishment was loud. Some were eerily quiet, almost contemplative. Consider solitary confinement in dark, narrow cells. These weren't the padded rooms of modern prisons, but tiny stone chambers, sometimes no larger than a coffin, where a person could be left for days or weeks. No food except bread and water. No light except what seeped through cracks. No company except rats and one's own thoughts. It was torture by absence, by silence. The body might survive, but the mind unraveled. Medieval authorities may not have had a formal understanding of psychology, but they knew how to break it. Then there was the matter of shame punishments. Imagine being forced to wear ridiculous outfits that advertise your crime. Thieves might wear giant wooden keys around their necks. Adulterers might be paraded with symbols of their offense. Bakers who sold underweight loaves could be made to carry bread hung around their neck until their spine ached. The idea was less about hurting the body than about marking the person as ridiculous. Because once laughter attaches to your name, it can be very difficult to shake off. And medieval people loved nothing more than a communal laugh at someone else's expense. And speaking of laughter, let's drift to the strange punishments reserved for nobles. You see, the higher your social rank, the more delicate the authorities had to be when disciplining you. Executing a peasant was straightforward. Executing a noble risked outrage. So, sometimes, humiliation was considered the safer route. Nobles might be forced to kneel in public, stripped of armor, or paraded through the streets in plain clothing. For men used to fine robes and heavy jewels, that loss of dignity was almost worse than a beating. Almost. Now, we should not pretend that these punishments were evenly applied. Justice in the Middle Ages was anything but blind. Wealth bought leniency. Status bought protection. A noble caught stealing might suffer embarrassment. A peasant caught stealing might lose a hand. The contrast was stark, and everyone knew it. And yet, somehow, the system held together. People muttered, but they accepted it was simply the way things were. The scales of justice weren't balanced, but they were consistent in their imbalance, which is almost the same thing. One of the more curious punishments, particularly in German towns, was a shame flute. Imagine a long wooden tube, fitted with metal clasps, placed around the neck and hands of a musician accused of playing badly, or more often of misconduct. The flute wasn't functional. It was purely symbolic. The poor musician was forced to wander the streets, mocked as a fool who could no longer play. It was oddly specific, but then medieval punishments often were. Why settle for a generic humiliation when you could tailor it to profession? This personalization extended even to torture. Bakers might be burned with hot irons shaped like bread stamps. Blacksmiths might be scorched with their own tools. It was poetic justice, though perhaps less poetic if you were on the receiving end. The message was clear. You had dishonored your trade, and now your trade will dishonor you. A tidy symmetry, the kind bureaucrats and judges always find so satisfying. And let's not forget the role of animals. Sometimes punishments involved dragging offenders through the streets tied backward on donkeys, a position designed to emphasize disgrace. Dogs might be set on criminals to chase them out of town. In rare cases, animals themselves were put on trial, particularly pigs accused of harming children. Yes, you heard that correctly. A pig could be brought before a judge, sentenced, and even executed, usually by hanging. It sounds absurd, but to medieval minds, order had to be maintained. If a pig misbehaved, it wasn't just an animal problem. It was a violation of divine law, and divine law had to be satisfied, one pig at a time. What all of this reveals is a society deeply concerned with order, appearance, and reputation. Pain mattered, yes, but shame mattered more, because shame lingered. It spread. It was contagious. A whipping stung for an hour. Humiliation haunted you forever. The medieval system of justice understood this all too well, and it wielded shame like a blade, sharp and efficient. As we drift toward the end of this part, let's reflect on a curious question. Which would you find worse? Being stretched on a rack in a hidden chamber, or being locked in the pillory while your neighbors laughed and pelted you with garbage? Would you rather suffer in silence or suffer in spectacle? It's not exactly a pleasant choice. But then again, medieval people rarely had pleasant choices when it came to justice. Share your thoughts in the comments if you'd like to play along with history's darker side. Let's drift a little deeper into the shadows now, into the quieter corners of castles and courts where torture was not entertainment for masses, but a calculated tool for the powerful. Because while the pillory and the cucking stool were perfect for public amusement, some matters were simply too delicate or too politically dangerous to be staged in the town square. These were the moments reserved for stone chambers, iron hinges, and whispered threats in the dark. One of the most infamous instruments of private persuasion was the rack. We've touched on it before, but it deserves a slower look. The design was simple enough. A rectangular frame, ropes for the wrists and ankles, and a turning wheel. Slowly, steadily, the ropes tightened, stretching the body until joints popped. What's remarkable isn't that it worked, but that it was so effective with so little effort. The torturer didn't need to be strong. The device did the work. A child could turn the crank, and a grown man could be unmade. It was cruelty mechanized, centuries before industry found other uses for gears and levers. And the people who authorized its use knew exactly what they were doing. Torture wasn't random, it was bureaucratic. Judges issued permissions. Clerks recorded details. Confessions were signed, sometimes with shaky hands, sometimes with mere mark, since holding a pen after the rack was not an easy task. The process gave the appearance of order, of fairness, as though stretching someone's shoulders out of their sockets was just another step in due diligence. The cruelty was real, but it came wrapped in paperwork. Let's pause to notice the irony here. Medieval society, often painted as chaotic or lawless, actually adored rules. Rules for inheritance, rules for markets, rules for punishments. Torture itself came with rules. You couldn't just stretch someone indefinitely. The law often specified limits. How many turns of the wheel? How many hours in the chair? How many blows from the rod? Of course, whether anyone obeyed those limits was another matter. But on parchment, at least, the rules were neat. You could imagine the sense of order it gave to a world that was otherwise unpredictable, filled with plague, famine, and endless small wars. Moving from the rack, let's drift to the strappado. Here, The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. Then, with no ceremony at all, they were dropped just enough to jerk the shoulders violently. The joints would dislocate, tendons would tear, and pain would radiate through the body. Simple, portable, efficient. It required only a rope, a pulley, and an imagination unbothered by screams. Unlike the rack, the strappado didn't leave many marks. Useful if you wanted your victim to be presentable later, perhaps for a confession delivered in court. The strappado was particularly popular in inquisitorial settings, where the goal wasn't to kill but to extract agreement. After all, a confession obtained under visible mutilation might raise awkward questions. But a man who looked relatively intact, aside from trembling hands and sunken eyes, that was acceptable. It gave the impression of voluntary speech, even if everyone in the room knew better. In that sense, torture was as much theater in the dungeon as it was in the square. The audience was smaller, but the script was carefully followed. There were, of course, other instruments. The thumbscrew, for instance, a small clamp tightened around fingers or toes. Cheap, portable, and versatile. It lacked the grand drama of the wheel or rack, but it had a certain intimacy. The victim could see the device, feel each turn of the screw, and anticipate the next. Sometimes, anticipation was worse than the pain itself. Torturers understood this, consciously or not. A pause, a smile, a slow turning of the screw, all of it worked together to unravel resolve. Then there was the boot, not the kind you wear, though those were uncomfortable enough in medieval winters, but a device designed to crush legs. The victim's shin was placed inside a wooden or metal casing, and wedges were hammered in, splintering bones slowly. Some boots were designed with iron plates, others with layers of wood. All had the same effect, a gradual, grinding destruction that could be stopped at any moment, depending on how talkative the victim became. The boot was versatile, too. It could be used to punish, to extract, or simply to remind someone that silence was not in their best interest. And while all of this sounds grim, and it was, there's something revealing in the way torture instruments were shared across Europe. The rack was not confined to one kingdom. The strappado was not the invention of a single city. Technique spread as easily as trade goods. Torturers learned from one another, whether through manuals, word of mouth, or simple observation. Cruelty was part of the cultural exchange, as international as spices or silk. One wonders what it was like to be the craftsman commissioned to build these devices. Did they feel pride in their workmanship? Did they admire the smooth turn of a crank the way a carpenter admires a finely sanded chair? The records don't say. Perhaps it's better that way. Let's not forget, too, that torture was often paired with interrogation. Questions repeated over and over, demands shouted or whispered, names pressed for. And here we glimpse another irony. The information obtained under torture was notoriously unreliable. People confessed to whatever they thought would end the ordeal. Witches named other witches. Heretics implicated neighbors. Innocent men admitted to crimes they hadn't committed. And yet, despite knowing this, the authorities carried on. Why? Because the confession wasn't really about truth. It was about closure. It allowed judges to write case solved in their ledgers. It reassured the community that the system worked, even when it didn't. There is a temptation, from our safe vantage point, to laugh at the absurdity. But it's worth remembering that the logic of torture, pain as a shortcut to truth, has never truly vanished. Modern history is full of examples of people making the same mistake. Perhaps that is the most medieval thing of all. Not the iron boots or the ropes, but a belief that suffering reveals honesty. As we sit with that thought, let's drift sideways into something a little different. The strange overlap between torture and superstition, in which trials, for example, torture was not just about extracting confessions. It was about confirming beliefs. A woman accused of witchcraft might be shown the instruments, told that pain would reveal the devil's mark. Under duress, she would confess, and suddenly the world made sense again. The storm last year, the illness of the cattle, the strange birthmark on a child, all could be explained. Torture, in this sense, wasn't just about control. It was about narrative. It tied chaos into order, however brutally. One of the stranger superstitions was the idea that witches could only be identified by pain. Pinching, pricking, and pressing were all used to locate hidden marks supposedly left by the devil. Professional witch prickers roamed towns with long needles, stabbing at skin until they found a spot that did not bleed. This, they claimed, was proof of sorcery. In reality, it was proof that human skin has many quirks, and that a sharp needle wielded with confidence can convince people of almost anything. The victims, of course, had little say in the matter, and so torture and belief intertwined, feeding one another. The pain confirmed the suspicion. The suspicion justified the pain. A neat circular logic that trapped countless people within it. There's a kind of dreadful elegance in the cycle. Horrible, yes, but elegant in its self-sustaining cruelty. We might pause here and ask ourselves, how would we have fared? Could we have endured the strappado, the boot, the endless questioning? Or would we have broken at the first turn of the rack? It's not a comforting thought, but then again, neither is history itself. Perhaps the better question is, how much do we still allow fear and pain to shape our truths today? I'll leave you with that thought. If you'd like, share in the comments. Do you think you'd confess under torture, or would you have tried to hold out? There's no right answer. Only the quiet reminder that humans are fragile, and history has never forgotten that fact. Now, let's move slowly toward the final act of medieval punishment. Execution. A grim subject, yes. But one approached not with horror, but with that oddly drowsy fascination that comes from understanding human systems of control. After all, an execution in the Middle Ages was rarely about private suffering. It was the ultimate performance, carefully staged, widely observed, and, in its own strange way, profoundly social. The methods were numerous, each chosen with a peculiar combination of efficiency and symbolism. Hanging was common, simple, and effective. The condemned might be led through town in a mock procession, tied to a cart, the rope dangling, the hood pulled down over their face. The crowd watched. Merchants continued their sales. Children pointed and whispered. It was neither swift nor dramatic in the modern sense. Sometimes the rope snapped, necessitating a repeat performance. A medieval executioner would sigh, perhaps muttering, "Of course, it's never simple," before adjusting the knots and starting again. Beheadings, on the other hand, carried a certain aesthetic appeal for the elites. Nobles accused of treason or heresy often received this merciful form of death. It looked cleaner, more civilized, and less likely to terrify the town's children. Yet precision was everything. A misjudged swing of the axe could leave the victim alive, or partially alive, which, strangely enough, added to the audience's sense of drama. An audience they always had. Townsfolk gathered, lords stood back, and the clergy murmured prayers as the executioner raised the blade. The ritual was almost ceremonial, perhaps even a little graceful, in a very dark, fatal way. Fire, naturally, was dramatic. Burning at the stake had both practical and symbolic purposes. It consumed the body, erasing the sin or the perceived sin. Heretics, witches, and traitors were subjected to flames, often after a show trial. The spectacle reinforced authority, moral order, and divine justice simultaneously. The smell of charred wood and human flesh mingled with the aroma of roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors. It was, in a terrible sense, entertainment as well as instruction. One can almost hear the board commentary. Well, at least he won't be bothering anyone again. Another method, less common but memorable, was the breaking wheel for criminals deemed especially dangerous. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and limbs were shattered in prescribed sequence. This was not a method for subtlety. It was for spectacle. The entire town could witness, and every broken bone sent a message. Transgression carries a cost. And yet, there was still a rhythm to it, a procedure that turned cruelty into something almost orderly. Pain measured, limbs broken in sequence, the victim left displayed for days, so that their suffering continued to instruct and warn. Interestingly, executions often served as lessons of morality and social hierarchy. Nobles might receive a beheading, the crowd respectfully watching. Peasants might face hanging or the wheel, their agony a prolonged warning to those lower in rank. The lesson was clear. Status influenced your fate. And everyone, regardless of class, understood that very well. It reinforced the social fabric, whether or not one wanted it reinforced. Fear was a tidy way of keeping people in line, and executions were the most visible demonstration of that principle. And yet, there were bizarre rituals surrounding these deaths. Sometimes a condemned would be forced to wear signs announcing their crime. Sometimes they would be led through multiple towns before reaching the site, giving the public an extended opportunity for judgment. Clergy often accompanied the condemned, muttering prayers meant to save their soul. Merchants sometimes took the opportunity to sell charms or food. Execution was, in essence, a traveling circus, a macabre fair that reminded everyone of the consequences of disobedience. What's curious is the degree of ceremony involved. Even the simplest hanging might require multiple officials: the sheriff to oversee, the executioner to swing the rope, the clerk to record the event, and the clergy to offer last rites. It was organized chaos, a choreography that balanced authority, justice, and spectacle. Every movement had meaning. Every pause mattered. The condemned were actors in a drama scripted by law, custom, and superstition. And the audience, whether they liked it or not, were participants in that drama. Let's drift for a moment toward the psychological dimension. For the condemned, anticipation often rivaled the execution itself in terror. Imagine standing on a scaffold, hooded, ropes around your wrists, the crowd murmuring, some faces familiar, others strangers. The smell of smoke, the chatter, the occasional toss of a rotten apple. Time seems to stretch endlessly. Pain is anticipated rather than immediate, and in that anticipation, the mind begins to unravel. Torture wasn't always necessary when fear could be so precisely applied. Then there's the aftermath. Bodies were often left on display, hung from gallows, buried in unconsecrated ground, burned and scattered. These acts ensured that memory lingered, not just for the victim, but for the living. The moral of the story was etched into the landscape. Misbehavior carries consequences, and those consequences are permanent. You might think it overkill, but in a world with high mortality and low literacy, visual reminders were invaluable. A gallows at the town's edge communicated law far more effectively than a scroll in Latin ever could. Of course, execution was never entirely predictable. Things went wrong frequently. Axes missed, ropes snapped, fires blazed uncontrollably. Even the most carefully planned punishment could devolve into chaos. And yet, the spectacle itself remained intact. The audience had been present. The authority had been demonstrated. The moral lesson had been attempted. In a strange way, the unpredictability reinforced the system. Life was fragile, and misfortune could strike anyone at any time. Let's pause on the curious role of the executioner. Often socially marginalized, sometimes feared, sometimes secretly admired, they wielded immense power. Their hands could end a life, extract a confession, or stage an entire performance. They were, in a way, the linchpins of medieval justice. And yet, they were rarely celebrated. Their role was necessary but distasteful. They lived on the edge of society, neither fully part of it nor entirely apart, like an essential shadow. And even in death, punishment had its rituals. Some condemned were drawn and quartered, their limbs sent to distant towns. Others were burned slowly, witnesses required to observe. Even animals, rarely left unpunished, were executed for misbehavior in highly theatrical ways. The logic was consistent. The social order must be maintained, even if it required extraordinary measures. Pain, spectacle, humiliation, they were all tools to that end. As we drift toward the close of this part, let's consider the strange endurance of these methods. Modern audiences often shudder at medieval executions, but medieval people saw them as ordinary, perhaps even necessary. They were a society deeply invested in the visible demonstration of authority, a culture that believed law and morality were inseparable from public performance. There is something almost quaint in the consistency of it. Horrible, yes, but structured, patterned, predictable. In a world that offered little stability otherwise, perhaps that predictability was comforting. So, as you lie back, imagining a scaffold in a sleepy town square, consider this. Would you stare quietly at the proceedings, murmuring, well, justice is done? Or would you have thrown your apple a little harder, feeling that mischievous thrill? Medieval spectators had that choice every time. They participated, willingly or reluctantly, in the drama of life and death. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you were in a medieval town, watching an execution unfold, what would you have done? Quiet contemplation or chaotic participation? There's no judgment here, only the quiet reflection that history invites. Now, let's drift into a quieter, stranger corner of medieval punishment, where cruelty meets creativity, and the mind is as much a target as a body. Because if there's one thing medieval authorities were good at, it wasn't just hurting people. It was finding ways to make them remember the lesson forever. Pain was transient. Humiliation lasted a lifetime. Consider the infamous ducking stool. We've touched on it before, but there's more to its design than mere dunking. Victims were not simply plunged into water. They were sometimes swung over it, teased with pauses that stretched anticipation. The body might be soaked multiple times, the feet dangling, the head barely clearing the surface. The crowd murmured, laughed, and pointed. The victim's cries punctuated the air like a morbid music. The method was less about injury and more about the exquisite discomfort of suspense. In a way, it's almost poetic if your taste in poetry runs to misery. Another device of note is the jugs, a simple yet cruel tool. A metal collar fastened to a chain attached to a wall would clamp around a neck. The condemned could be displayed outside the town hall or church, forced to stand for hours, sometimes days, with only minimal movement allowed. The collar prevented escape, enforced posture, and reminded the individual that even small bodily freedoms could be taken away. It was subtle, silent, but profoundly effective. Humiliation here didn't rely on screams. It relied on stillness and exposure. And then there were the stocks. They often get lumped together with pillories in popular imagination, but they were subtly different. Stocks restrained the legs instead of, or in addition to, the arms. Victims might be left on the street for hours while passers-by jeered, pelted, or simply stared. The discomfort was compounded by the community's gaze, a relentless reminder that deviation from the norm had consequences. As with other punishments, the crowd's role was essential. One could argue that without an audience, the stocks were merely uncomfortable wood. With an audience, they became a theater of social control. Now, let's wander toward more elaborate instruments, the ones designed not just to hurt but to confound and confuse. The thumbscrew, for example, could be used on fingers or toes, but skilled torturers found variations. Victims were made to watch the device being prepared, feel the first tentative turns, and anticipate the tightening. Anticipation, again, was key. Humans tend to dread the unknown, and torturers relied on that psychological leverage. One twist of the screw, and resistance faltered, not always from pain, but from the mind's readiness to break before the body did. Similarly, the boot, often constructed from wood or iron, was less about elegance than efficiency. Legs could be crushed slowly, wedges inserted methodically, bones splintering under gradual force. The process was long, controlled, and terrifyingly predictable. The victim could calculate each step, but knowing what was coming didn't ease the suffering. Medieval minds seemed acutely aware that dread amplifies pain. They designed devices not just for force but for foresight. Even in the rarer executions, ritual mattered. Burning, hanging, beheading, all were laden with ceremony, designed to maximize the lesson while minimizing chaos. Yet, unpredictability remained. Ropes snapped, blades wavered, fires blazed irregularly. When plans failed, improvisation often amplified the spectacle. History preserved these accidents with a mixture of fascination and horror, noting the rare moments when an execution turned unexpectedly theatrical. And in those moments, the audience learned a different lesson. Life is fragile in authority, while confidence can fumble. Animals, curiously, were sometimes dragged into these spectacles. Pigs accused of harming children, dogs implicated in theft. Even insects subject to ritualized trials were used to demonstrate moral order. A pig might be dressed in tiny clothes and hanged. A dog might be dragged through the streets. It seems absurd, yet the message was clear. If natural order could be disturbed, something, human or otherwise, must answer. Medieval minds, for all their faith, required visible justice in every form. And while the devices themselves were formidable, the psychological dimension is equally striking. Imagine being led to a rack or a boot, the instruments gleaming, the crowd murmuring, the official nodding at the precise moment. The body was merely one part of the punishment. The mind absorbed a constant pressure, dread, expectation, shame, and social judgment. Torture was thus a single act in a prolonged symphony of distress. Instruments, witnesses, and ritual worked together to orchestrate compliance. Religious justification also played a role. Pain, it was believed, could purify the soul or reveal truth. Clergy might accompany the condemned, offering prayers even as fingers were crushed or backs stretched. The dichotomy is striking. Mercy spoken as joints were dislocated, salvation promised amid screams. To modern sensibilities, it seems contradictory. To medieval ones, it was simply life. Order, obedience, and morality were inseparable from suffering. There is a pattern here. Public and private punishment, physical and psychological torment, ritual and improvisation. They all intersected in a world where control was fragile and fear was cheap. The medieval system relied less on fairness than on visibility. Laws were reinforced not just by enforcement, but by spectacle. Community involvement turned punishment into performance. Pain was a tool, yes, but humiliation, fear, and anticipation were equally vital. Even unusual punishments fit this pattern. Scolds forced into the cucking stool, thieves paraded with signs, noblemen shamed in public. All were variations on a theme. The form adapted to social rank, profession, gender, and even local custom. Consistency lay not in method, but in effect. The condemned became an object lesson, a living illustration of consequence. And yet, there is a gentle irony in all of this. Despite meticulous design, people were unpredictable. Crowds could sympathize, officials could falter, instruments could fail. Human variability always undermined control. It's a reminder that even the most carefully designed systems of power rely on fragile assumptions, that fear will bend all wills, that the mind submits to expectation, that spectators absorb the lesson. History shows us that this is never entirely true. So, as we drift through these reflections, consider this question. If you'd lived in a medieval town, watching an unusual punishment unfold, perhaps a cucking stool, perhaps a strange mechanical device, would you have participated eagerly, whispered your commentary, or looked away, hoping to preserve your own calm? History rarely provides comfortable answers, but it does offer endless contemplation. And with that, we pause, floating gently among the wooden stocks, iron clamps, and subtle rituals of cruelty, letting the quiet weight of human ingenuity in punishment settle around us. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have faced the strange, creative punishments of medieval towns? Now, let's drift into the darker, stranger, and perhaps more fascinating corners of medieval belief, the world of superstition and witch trials, a place where fear, ritual, and justice intertwined in ways that seem baffling to us today, yet made perfect sense to those living at the time. Because in a world of plague, famine, and unpredictable misfortune, someone or something had to be blamed, and often that someone was entirely human, conveniently located, and accused of dealing with powers beyond comprehension. Witch trials are familiar in modern imagination. The pointed hats, the cauldrons, the fiery stakes. Yet the reality was less theatrical in some ways and far more insidious in others. Accusations could start with something as mundane as a neighbor falling ill, crops failing, or a cow mysteriously dying. Communities were tight-knit and personal grudges were common. Combine superstition with resentment, and suddenly the simplest misfortune could be explained as witchcraft. Who better to punish than the person conveniently standing nearby, especially if they were different in appearance, behavior, or reputation? Once accused, the procedures could vary widely, but fear was the constant. Interrogation often involved both subtle psychological pressure and outright torture. The accused might be asked to name accomplices, describe pacts with the devil, or admit to impossible acts. Clergy and officials insisted that confession would lead to salvation, if only the person admitted the truth. The logic was deeply flawed, of course, but it was persuasive under extreme duress. Humans are surprisingly malleable when suffering, and medieval authorities knew this. One of the more peculiar practices was the pricking of witches. A long, sharp needle would be applied to the accused's body, searching for the devil's mark, a spot that allegedly did not bleed or feel pain. Every twitch, every flinch, could be read as proof, and because needles are uncomfortable, even innocent movements might be misinterpreted. The result was that almost anyone could be found guilty. The method was remarkably effective at confirming the authorities' suspicions, if not actual guilt, and efficiency in those days was considered a virtue. Witch trials were also social events, in a manner of speaking. Spectators often attended, watching the accused struggle, confess, or resist. Gossip mingled with prayer, curiosity mingled with fear. A person accused of witchcraft was not just punished. They were turned into a symbol, a cautionary tale for the entire community. And because superstition often targeted women more than men, these trials reinforced social hierarchies as well. A loud, outspoken, or independent woman was suddenly vulnerable in ways her male neighbors were rarely subjected to. The inquisitors, meanwhile, were professional, if morally flexible. They operated within a framework that justified extreme measures in the name of truth and salvation. Torture, interrogation, and psychological pressure were all permissible tools when the alleged crime involved the devil. And so, the accused, often terrified and exhausted, confessed to whatever the inquisitors suggested. Names were given, plots described, and pacts imagined. And with each confession, the circle of suspicion widened. Accusations spread like wildfire, feeding both fear and authority. It is fascinating to note the role of documentation. Inquisitors meticulously recorded confessions, often with great detail. Some surviving manuscripts describe the exact words, gestures, and alleged magical acts of the accused. For us, reading them is like peering into a very different logic. The methods seem absurd, the confessions impossible, yet at the time, every detail reinforced a narrative. The devil was real, witches were dangerous, and the authorities were justified. It was all part of a tightly knit worldview. Sometimes the punishments for witchcraft were unimaginably cruel, sometimes surprisingly mundane. The stakes, of course, were often literal. Burning, hanging, or drowning were common. Other times, humiliation or public shaming sufficed. A woman might be forced to parade through town with sign announcing her crime, dunked repeatedly in a pond, or confined in small, dark spaces. Each method reinforced a dual message. Crime has consequences, and deviation from social or religious norms is dangerous. And yet, for all the horror, there is a peculiar pattern of ritual and consistency. Accusations, interrogation, confession, and punishment followed a set script, much like the other forms of medieval justice we've discussed. Predictability, perhaps, offered comfort to authorities and spectators alike. It also gave the accused, paradoxically, a sense of what to expect, even if that expectation was terrifying. Knowledge, in this case, did not reduce suffering. It only allowed anticipation to magnify it. Curiously, these trials often target behaviors rather than actual deeds. Gossiping, quarrels, petty theft, or mere eccentricity could become evidence of witchcraft. The logic was flexible, adaptive to circumstance. A neighbor's complaint, a child's accusation, or a minor social transgression could escalate into the full machinery of the inquisitorial process. The system, once set in motion, required only momentum to carry the accused toward confession and punishment. And momentum, as we know, is difficult to stop. In some regions, torture was applied with exacting precision. Devices like the rack, strappado, or thumbscrew might be employed, not merely to inflict pain, but to guide the confession in a certain direction. One wonders, reading these accounts, how much the inquisitors believed in the supernatural elements themselves. Did they see themselves as neutral seekers of truth, or as agents enforcing a cosmic order? Perhaps both. Human psychology is always complex, especially when sanctioned by religious authority. An intriguing aspect of witch trials is the role of children. In some cases, young witnesses or accusers were taken seriously, their testimony often unquestioned. A child's claim that a neighbor had flown on a broomstick or cast a spell could carry the weight of evidence. This reliance on youthful observation added an almost surreal element to proceedings. Adults, trained in logic and observation, deferred to imagination and fear. The result was a court of law where reason bowed to collective anxiety, and where the extraordinary became ordinary. Superstition, fear, and social control intertwined seamlessly in these trials. Confessions, even under torture, legitimized authority. Public punishment reinforced social hierarchy. And through it all, spectators participated, whether out of curiosity, belief, or a simple desire for entertainment. It is a reminder, gentle but persistent, that fear has always been a tool of power, and that human imagination can be as binding as any chain. As we drift toward the close of this part, consider the quiet, eerie logic of it all. The accused, terrified and exhausted, confirms every suspicion. The authorities satisfied, record the confession. The community, reassured, goes home, having witnessed the consequences of deviation. The world momentarily feels orderly, but the machinery continues, ready to process the next misfortune, the next rumor, the next human being unfortunate enough to attract attention. So here, in the quiet reflection of candlelight and gentle narration, let's ask ourselves, if you live in that world, would you challenge the accusations, whisper in defense of a neighbor, or remain silent, hoping not to attract notice? History rarely offers comfort, but it does invite contemplation. Leave your thoughts in the comments, letting your imagination drift into that strange, fearful, yet curiously organized medieval world. Now, let's move away from public punishment and ritualized fear and drift into the private chambers of medieval royalty. Because cruelty wasn't reserved solely for peasants and witches. Royals had their own peculiar brand of misery, much of it self-inflicted and often delightfully ironic. The lives of kings and queens, for all their wealth and power, were marked by strange habits, fragile bodies, and dynastic anxieties that sometimes seem almost comedic, if your sense of humor can tolerate sad bones and faintly confused turnips. Take the matter of inbreeding. You might imagine that centuries of royal intermarriage were simply a matter of convenience or politics, and you'd be partly right. Marrying cousins, aunts, nieces, why not? Keep the blood pure, consolidate power, prevent outsiders from getting a seat at the table. The result, however, was not so pure in practice. Royal families sometimes resembled genetic experiments, with fragile children, odd deformities, and minds capable of both brilliance and sudden eccentricity. The Habsburg jaw, a protrusion so notorious it dominated portraits, is a perfect example. It wasn't just aesthetic. It was a marker of generations of careful, if misguided, purity. And yet, the families persisted, because dynastic logic often outweighed common sense. Childhood in royal households was often a peculiar blend of privilege and peril. Young princes and princesses were pampered beyond reason, yet confined by rules and tutors, each meal, lesson, and nap carefully scheduled. Illness could strike at any moment, and with limited medical understanding, small infections became life-threatening. Some children were excessively spoiled, developing eccentric habits. Others were fragile, delicate, and in constant need of protection, or endless supervision by anxious adults. A royal nursery was less a playground and more a miniature battlefield of hygiene, education, and political maneuvering. And then there were the strange personal quirks. Kings who refused to wear shoes, queens obsessed with rare perfumes, nobles terrified of invisible insects. Sometimes these habits were harmless. Sometimes they were peculiar coping mechanisms, and sometimes they were the seeds of legend. Chroniclers, never one to resist exaggeration, often amplified these quirks, ensuring that history remembered the eccentricities alongside the policies and wars. One can almost imagine the bored scribes whispering in margins. He prefers to eat with a golden spoon while muttering to his cats. Naturally, he ruled wisely. Dynastic pressure could also manifest in odd marriages. Alliances were arranged without concern for compatibility, affection, or sanity. A king might wed a distant cousin, a teenage bride pulled from another country, her language incomprehensible, her customs alien. Courtiers and clergy oversaw, diplomats negotiated, and the bride and groom were expected to produce heirs. Love was optional, cooperation was mandatory, and when things went wrong, it could be spectacular. Scandals, secret affairs, or outright rebellion punctuated royal households with quiet chaos, as dramatic as any public spectacle, yet far more intimately felt. Sickly children were another common theme. Royal genetics, poor hygiene, and constant illness often meant that children never thrived. Some succumbed to fevers, others to infections, and still others grew up fragile and malformed. The royal family might mourn publicly, celebrate marriages privately, and keep secrets about deformities that could weaken claims to the throne. The result was a world where appearances mattered enormously, yet reality was frequently inconvenient. Court life was a constant exercise in image management, and the margins were often tragic. Consider the petty meltdowns, which were more common than we might assume. A king might throw a tantrum over a poorly presented dish. A queen could erupt in insult, real or imagined. Nobles, constrained by etiquette, learned to tiptoe, bow, and speak only when spoken to, lest they witness the royal displeasure firsthand. Power magnified human temperament, and in medieval courts, temperament had consequences. Children learned quickly. A minor offense would echo in stories for decades. A lapse in manners could spiral into political misfortune. The strange intersection of superstition and domestic life also played a role. Royals consulted astrologers, alchemists, and physicians who claimed to predict the future, cure illness, or secure heirs. Sometimes remedies were simple, herbal tonics, rest, diet, but often they were bizarre, elaborate, and sometimes mildly dangerous. Take bloodletting, for instance, applied liberally to sick princes and princesses. The logic was simple: drain the bad blood. The result, occasionally fatal, was usually catastrophic for health. Yet physicians were respected, astrologers revered, and every failure recorded as an unfortunate consequence of misfortune rather than error. Petty jealousies among family members were also amplified by dynastic necessity. Siblings plotted, mothers maneuvered, cousins whispered, heirs contested for primacy. Queens sought influence over children, and uncles and aunts pursued favors. Court life was, in essence, a game of chess played with humans, where each piece had fragile motions and occasionally a mysterious disease. The stakes were high, the strategies convoluted, and the consequences often irreversible. And yet, despite illness, eccentricity, and fragility, royal life offered a unique lens on resilience. Children grew, sometimes despite every medical and political disadvantage. Alliances held, sometimes surprisingly well. Odd habits, eccentric personalities, and even genetic quirks became defining traits, recorded in manuscripts, painted in portraits, and whispered in chronicles. History remembered not only victories and defeats, but the way a king hummed while signing a treaty, or how a princess insisted on sleeping with her cats for comfort. It's worth noting the sheer ordinariness of these extraordinary lives. Royals were not superhuman. They suffered from fevers, boredom, jealousy, and awkward social demands. They cried, they threw tantrums, they hid in closets to escape scrutiny. Their grandeur did not exempt them from the small miseries of daily existence. It only magnified those miseries for others to witness. Power amplified human flaws as much as it protected them from ordinary dangers. And finally, the legacy of inbreeding, eccentricity, and fragile childhoods reminds us that medieval elites, for all their authority, were intimately human. They were fragile, anxious, and often at odds with themselves. Their lives, recorded in manuscripts, letters, and paintings, show us not only the opulence of courts, but the strangeness of ordinary existence magnified by politics, duty, and expectation. There's a quiet fascination in watching their small dramas unfold, a gentle reminder that power and misery are not mutually exclusive. So, as we drift toward the end of this section, consider this. If you were a royal child in a lavish chamber, attended by tutors, nurses, and endless well-meaning advisors, would you have been able to endure the strange rules, the constant observation, and the subtle fear of misstepping? Or would you have found your own small rebellions, hiding behind curtains, whispering to cats and dogs, quietly asserting your humanity? Share your thoughts in the comments, letting your imagination wander through those gilded halls and fragile dynasties. Now, let's drift slowly toward the final reflections of our journey through medieval strangeness, cruelty, and quiet eccentricity. We wandered through town squares of public punishment, the shadowy halls of inquisitors, and the gilded chambers of fragile, inbred royalty. The thread that binds all of this is the extraordinary human capacity for ritual, fear, and control, and the equally extraordinary ways people endured, adapted, and occasionally rebelled. If we step back, the pattern becomes clear. Medieval life was a constant negotiation between authority and survival. For peasants, punishment was public and performative. For accused witches, fear was psychological as much as physical. For nobles and monarchs, eccentricity, frailty, and dynastic obligation were themselves forms of constraint. The system operated like a vast, oddly meticulous machinery. Each cog, torture device, inquisitor, chronicler, or royal tutor, moving in predictable yet sometimes unpredictable ways. And yet, what strikes us most is not the cruelty, but the human dimension. The victims, accused, and even the powerful were all navigating circumstances largely beyond their control. A peasant might endure a ducking stool with stoic resignation or a whispered defiance. A queen might insist on a peculiar ritual, her eccentricity tolerated in a court otherwise obsessed with order. A prince might survive multiple fevers to eventually inherit the throne, carrying both family legacy and frailty in equal measure. History remembers their triumphs, their failures, and often their quirks with the same drowsy fascination we feel today. It's also worth reflecting on the remarkable creativity, albeit grim, that accompanied punishment and superstition. Torture devices were not merely functional. They were, in a way, instruments of pedagogy. Rituals, confession, and public spectacle were designed to teach lessons, enforce obedience, and reinforce moral and social codes. Even failures of design, broken ropes, misfired axes, stubborn prisoners, offered unexpected insight into the limitations of control and the unpredictability of human behavior. The medieval mind understood that fear could be as effective as force, and anticipation could be as persuasive as suffering. Similarly, dynastic eccentricities reveal the persistence of human curiosity, ambition, and even humor in constrained circumstances. Royal children endured fragile health, relentless supervision, and bizarre expectations. Spouses navigated political alliances and genetic hazards. Advisors, clerics, and chroniclers recorded every oddity, every tantrum, every minor scandal. And in the midst of this, ordinary humanity persisted. Hunger, playfulness, whimsy, and defiance, reminding us that even power cannot fully suppress the quirks of human nature. One cannot help but smile quietly at some of the ironies. Kings who ruled vast lands, yet obsessed over minor personal comfort. Queens commanding armies of servants, yet fretting over feline companionship. Inquisitors demanding confessions while their victims whispered the impossible. Devices designed for terror, yet often failing in amusingly mundane ways. The medieval world was tragic, yes, but also absurd in ways that only hindsight and a calm evening reflection can fully reveal. As we draw near the close, imagine the rhythm of this world. The crowd murmurs in a town square. A royal child coughs in a gilded chamber, which faces her inquisitor. A family debates a marriage alliance. Everything is simultaneous, interconnected, and peculiar. Life, for all its grandeur and brutality, moves forward in small, strangely ordinary ways. The spectacle, the superstition, the fragile bodies, the eccentric minds, they all coexist in a pattern both chaotic and strangely elegant. And now, in this quiet moment, we can reflect on the lessons without urgency or alarm. Perhaps the greatest lesson is endurance. Human beings, powerful and powerless alike, adapted, survived, and left traces for us to study. They laughed in private, cried in solitude, and negotiated the impossible demands of society. In observing their lives, we glimpse both our fragility and resilience, and perhaps, in that quiet observation, we find a soft comfort. So, as we prepare to close this journey through centuries of human strangeness, I invite you to consider a few gentle questions. Which story surprised you the most? The public punishments, the inquisitorial procedures, or the strange personal lives of royals? Which eccentricity or oddity would you have found most amusing or most distressing if you lived in that time? Share your reflections in the comments. Your imagination is as much a part of history as the events themselves. And finally, If you enjoyed this slow journey through the medieval world, consider supporting the channel in the quietest way possible. Like, share, and subscribe. These small actions help keep history gentle, drowsy, and abundant for future nights of reflection. Perhaps you'll revisit these stories. Imagine the creaking stocks, the whispered accusations, or the gilded, fragile chambers. History, after all, is a soft companion, if we allow it to be. Thank you for drifting through this world with me. Sleep gently, dream of odd courts, curious inquisitors, and strange devices, and let the faintly sardonic humor of the past lull you toward rest. And remember, history is never as orderly as we think, but it is always quietly fascinating.